do rotate out, so we'll try to keep the discussion going. So if you could do that, I'd really appreciate it. My goal only is to make sure that we get as many people involved as possible. So without further ado, I'm going to briefly introduce the panelists, and then I'm going to turn it over to them for their 3 minutes. So Tom Hansen, where's Tom? You heard from him. He's the owner and president of AmeriPhysics, which is an NRC licensed decommissioning firm. He and his company are based in Knoxville, but they've been involved in projects all over the world. He's a certified health physicist and project management professional, and he has a master's degree in health physics. John Dunn is a 47-year physician and 39-year attorney with a special interest in problems of excessive administrative state and proper application of rules on admissibility of scientific evidence in administrative and judicial hearings and trials. Let's see. Otsuru Niwa. Dr. Niwa is a radiation biologist who found that his scientific knowledge was of no use to help Fukushima residents who were suffering from strong anxiety staying after the Fukushima Daiichi accident in March of 2011. After living in the city of Fukushima for 3 years, he began to understand that the bottom line of the problem was really something beyond radiation, and he'd like to share some of his experiences with us today. Ryoko Ando was born in 1976. She grew up in Hiroshima, and she studied comparative literature, and she is a professional Japanese gardener. After the Fukushima nuclear power disaster, she established Ethos in Fukushima, an organization with residents conducting radiological protection activities. And is it Bonet? Bon Posma, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. He has expertise in electric power generation, and he is in charge of Nuclear Africa, which is an organization that promotes the use of nuclear energy in Africa. Okay, so without further ado, why don't we start with Bon? Would you mind starting?
Not at all.
Okay. And then just so you know, there's a person back there who will raise the stop sign at the 3-minute mark, and then I'm supposed to come and give you the hook.
Okay. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I started Nuclear Africa 5 years ago on my frequent visit to South Africa. I live in Florida, but I visit South Africa 3 or 4 times a year. Nuclear Africa exists to promote nuclear energy in all Africa. And until 4 or 5 months ago, we were doing pretty well in South Africa until the government changed. The old government was in favor of nuclear energy. The new government had decided to go green, and they're going to have 11.4 gigawatts of wind energy installed in the next 12 years. So our campaign has not been very successful with the new government, although we've had some success in Zambia, in Kenya and Uganda, and especially the Ugandans are very interested in nuclear medicine. About 7 months ago, we started a group called Campaign for Truth in Energy. And we wondered why it is that the standards that are applied to nuclear energy are not applied to wind energy and solar energy. For example, in wind energy, you draw substantial amounts of energy from the atmosphere. Has anyone studied to see if that has any effect on climate or on weather? It may not, but nobody studied that. The other thing is that you kill birds. It's estimated that in South Africa, the death rate for birds is about 4 birds per megawatt of generated capacity. The other thing we're looking at is effect on insect life, bats, and so we're also asking about the problem with solar energy. There have been a lot of accidents in South Africa where birds think that the solar panels are water and they dive into the solar panels and get killed. So in terms of communication, we want to emphasize that the same standards that apply to nuclear energy should be applied to other forms of energy. At the present time, the emphasis is on wind energy. It will be 15% of South Africa's energy mix by 2030 will be wind, about 10% solar, and the rest of it will be coal, nuclear, and on hydro. There's one more thing. A few weeks ago, I was meeting with the chief engineer of Eskom, and they run this Kubrick nuclear power plant. Now, Kubrick is about 1.8 gigawatts of energy, of power production, and they applied what is called the lessons of Fukushima. And whenever people tell that to me, that means that you are going to make your reactor more expensive and even more or less affordable. And the amount of money was $100 million, and they reckon that'll save one life for every million years of operation. And so I see that the stop sign there. That's all I have to say for now.
Thank you. Next, we'd like to ask Ryoko Ando for her presentation.
The organizer asked me to sit as a panelist. Since there is no interpreter today, please allow me to read a short statement instead. It is about the role of radiation dose in the government evacuation policy in Japan. The Japanese government had to make two major decisions regarding evacuation in the accident. The first was issuing the order immediately after the accident. The nuclear disaster prevention guidelines had envisioned evacuation and ordered evacuation for areas where the external exposure dose was expected to greater than 50 millisievert per year. But the survey meters around the Fukushima No. 1 nuclear power plant were damaged and incapacitated, and there was no data to rely on. So the government used the distance from the plant as a measure and ordered that the area within 20-kilometer radius of the plant be evacuated. The government rearranged the areas were rearranged several times, but even after the actual dose data became available, the 20-kilometer radius was continued to be used as a standard. The second decision was lifting the order. The government first lifted the order in April 2014. By April 2017, most orders were lifted except for the areas labeled difficult to return area. I'd like you to note that it took 3 years for the government before it could start lifting the order in April 2014. Before the accident, the government did not have any standard to lift the evacuation order. In December 2011, the cabinet decided 3 conditions to lift the order, which included a requirement that the total dose should be well below 20 millisievert per year. These conditions could not be implemented as planned. In reality, the doses in many areas in the evacuation zone were lower than 20 millisievert per year. We must remember that it took more than 3 years to lift the evacuation order in Fukushima, not because the radiation dose was high. It was not because the government set those limit of 20 millisievert per year was too strict to archive. The cause of delay was because the dose limit was not actually used in the decision-making process.
Thank you very much. Why don't we just go down the list, and I think, Tom, you're next.
All right, so I know I have already had an opportunity to speak today, but I'll point out that I haven't stood for 1 second behind that microphone back there. So if given a platform to speak, especially on something as important as communication, I'm going to talk about a pet peeve in the way that we communicate about radiation risk assessment. So does anybody here remember the Randi Prize? James Randi was a former magician, and he offered to pay out a prize of $1 million to anybody who could demonstrate a supernatural or paranormal ability. The challenge started in 1964, and though thousands of people tried to get the prize, nobody ever earned it. I have a similar challenge for you, except for I'm not willing to part with $1 million. But show me where you're using the word conservative in a manner that would withstand criticism from professional risk assessors. You know, if you believe that a paradigm shift is warranted and you want to be part of that shift, strike the word conservative from your vocabulary. Refuse to tolerate it from the folks that surround you. Alara is not conservative. Alara is not conservative. I took notes this morning here and they're gone now because my phone is beeping at me. So Alara is not conservative. LNT is not conservative. None of the other models we could pick are conservative. Basing your results on some worst-case assumption is not conservative. Those are risk trade-offs. How can you claim that something is conservative if you haven't done the homework to consider whether or not there's any countervailing risks as a result of your decision-making? When I read the word conservative in an article or report, I almost always associate it with laziness on the part of the author. You know, the conservatism is almost always because the hard steps that could have been taken to determine the real risk have been skipped, or that the data do not reflect something that somebody's willing to publish. That's not conservatism, that's laziness. James Randi was upset that magicians were disguising themselves as people with powers in order to lie to the public in a harmful way. The way the radiation protection community uses the word conservatism is a lie. And we need to escape that lie if we expect to achieve optimal policymaking leading to the paradigm shift that most in this room seem to support. And until we do, we're going to continue to be part of the problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Newell, you're going to pass?
No, I'll give my 3 minutes.
Okay. John, please.
I listened to the presentations this morning, and there were many of them were very insightful. And I would ask a couple questions of the audience. One is, if some of the parties are not willing to accept that there is any safe level for whatever you're regulating, how can you do the risk trade-off thing? I think it's important for us to consider that. So Eisenhower's farewell speech is something I mentioned yesterday. The danger of the research government complex and the amount of money that can exchange hands that influences the way people act. And H.L. Mencken's statement about the goal of practical politics is something that you should take home with you. Justice Blackmun was the one who wrote the opinion in Daubert versus Merrill Dow, which in 1993 said there are some rules about what we're going to accept as evidence from science. And the rules are, has to be testable. The theory or technique has to be subjected to peer review and publication, but that's considered not to be dispositive, but additive. The techniques and method must be known and there must be a known potential rate of error. In other words, the statistical analysis and the methodology have to be properly described and properly evaluated. And the acceptance of the theory and technique is in the relevant scientific community. The illegal human experiments that were done by the U.S. EPA had to do with exposing human beings of varying levels of good health or bad health to air pollution, and the focus was small particles. Diesel emissions are a good example of small particles. I was involved in a lawsuit to try to stop the human experiments when we found out about them in about 2011. The reason we found out about it was they published it in a National Institutes of Health's journal, an online journal called Environmental Perspectives, describing a 54-year-old obese, hypertensive woman with a family history of heart disease who was put in a chamber, and emissions from a diesel engine were put into the chamber with her, where she was supposed to be in there for 2 hours. At about 20 minutes, she's developed a cardiac arrhythmia. It's not important for you to know all the details of what really this was about. It was about human experiments. And human experiments are unlawful in America and throughout the world if those experiments could harm an individual. And individuals cannot consent to those experiments. Because obviously you could pressure people that work for you, you could pressure prisoners, members of the military, to consent to a harmful experiment. So, we complained. We sued to try to stop the suit, and the lawsuit was dismissed by the court because we were not subjects of the experiments. The Inspector General said there's a problem here, and it was referred, go down, it was referred eventually by the EPA to the National Research Council of the National Association, or the National Academies of Science. National Research Council formed a 16-member panel, most of whom were EPA grantees, and after two years, they said, we don't see any problem here. Even though the administrator of the EPA said small particles kill more than 300,000 people a year in the United States, you can do your human experiments because we don't really think that it's that toxic. We certainly don't think it's the kind of thing that causes that many deaths. So you can do the human experiments. I would have to say that that's an example. It's a similar situation with linear no threshold, which says essentially there's no safe level of radiation. We don't have any tolerance for the idea that radiation, and the reason I say it's similar is John Samet in 2006 wrote an essay in the New England Journal of Medicine. You may know who he is. He was the chairman of the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee for the EPA for more years than anybody else. And here's what he said in his essay. It was an editorial. There is no safe level of small particles. So essentially, we can expect that the EPA will continue to grind down on the air standards. And the problem with LNT is we've got a similar situation. There is no safe level of radiation. Then how can you talk about safe levels?
John, I'm sorry.
It's done. Thank you. I wasn't watching back there. Don't mean to violate the rule.
Well, I want to thank the panelists. I see we have about 5 minutes before we reach half of our time. So I just want, and two of us didn't speak, so I want to just ask people to begin to line up. But while you're doing that, I do want to cede back a couple of minutes because I know, Bohm, you didn't have a chance to speak yet, and we did cut you off. So if you want a minute or two. No, I meant in addition to what he said today. I'm sorry. In addition to being on this panel, others have had chances to speak on other panels, but you haven't, so I wanted to give you back a minute or two, if I could.
Yes.
And then we'll move to the comments.
Yeah, we're talking from a South African perspective, and one of the conclusions we came to, there is, when people say, we are going to make reactors safer, it is what we call negative priming. It sort of indicates to the general population that reactors are not safe, but we can make them safer. If you look at statistics, nuclear energy is by far the safest form of generating electric power. For example, in coal mining, we lose about 100,000 people for every terawatt hour of generated electricity. And all the way down to nuclear, if we include Chernobyl, we're looking at 90 people. So it's 90 versus 100,000 for coal, which is still the largest supplier of electrical energy in the world. So one of the things that we in South Africa are telling our friends is, please don't use the word nuclear safety. Just don't associate it. Nuclear power is so safe. It is so incredibly safe. It doesn't need to be. We don't have to keep emphasizing that we're going to make it safer. And whenever people talk about making nuclear power stations safer, it means we'll make them even more expensive. So safety, and they're made unnecessarily safe. And the other thing that I'd like to propose is that people talk about nuclear waste. We prefer to use unused fuel because the word waste has a negative connotation, and I don't think it's accurate because the spent fuel is actually unused fuel that could be recycled. So these are some of the things that we'd like to sort of, we use in South Africa to help promote nuclear energy and make the public accept nuclear energy.
Okay, thank you. If you just join me in thanking the panelists. And now we'll go to the microphone, so please.
My name's Craig Little. I used to work for Oak Ridge National Laboratory. I led a team based in Grand Junction. We were involved in the uranium mill tailings remedial action project that Mark Miller mentioned yesterday. Our job was to conduct surveys of so-called vicinity properties. Those were places that had been contaminated by taking the mill tailings away from the site and using it in any way that you use sand. Our task was to do 13,000 surveys all across the country. The first thing we had to do in every instance was to talk to the homeowner and get their approval for us to set foot on the property. In many of these places, Grand Junction being one of them, property owners thought this project was a crock, thought it was a waste of money, etc. We settled on an argument in some cases to convince them to let us on their property because it was stigmatized because it had tailings on it. If they ever wanted to sell it, they had to get it cleaned up, or at least a clean bill of health. Sometimes they say, we don't care. I'd say, how about your kids? They may inherit the house. Most of the time we won that argument. So economics, I think, plays a big role in risk trade-off analysis, and my comment is really directed to Mr. Hansen. And the next question, the next point where economics plays a big role is that Mark Miller commented yesterday that UMTRA was a $2 billion project. Who got that $2 billion? Well, contractors. So how do we factor in the economics of cleaning up this stuff that everybody would look around at and say, this isn't a very big problem? How do we factor that into risk trade-off analysis?
Yeah, there's no reason you cannot consider the economic risks in risk trade-off analysis. That is certainly is one of the risks. You're looking at all the risks involved. It's just different from most of the other types of risk trade-off analysis, like cost-benefit analysis, where what you're aimed at is really you're trying to translate everything into a cost. You're trying to translate radiation exposure into a cost, and then you're comparing cost versus cost, right? Money. That turns off people right away. So I misspoke if you heard that cost isn't one of the risks. You're just not turning everything into money risks first. It's just risk versus risk. Thank you.
Thanks.
I do risk assessments, risks of transporting radioactive materials. So I'm right there in the front line. It's part of every environmental impact statement that involves transportation that is done to get an NRC license or DOE. I do a lot of them for DOE. And one of the points I wanted to make is that in order to compare risks, you need numbers which are real as you can get them. And I'd like to just point to this notion that diesel fumes kill X people per year. That is derived from a statistical proposition that particles of a certain size cause cancer or some kind of fatal respiratory disease, and that you can make that assumption from something that goes in the air. I used to do tons of air dispersion problems. You can make that assumption. There is very little to back that up. I want to make the point that if you're going to do especially comparative risk assessments, you need to look at numbers that you can really rely on, not just, and that's hard. That's hard to do. Let me give you the one example that immediately comes to mind is we have speed limits. Those are numbers. You can calculate, and we have data that shows that if you lower the speed limit from X to Y, you get fewer car accidents. And these are all things that can be measured. So I would encourage you, when you're looking at comparative risk analysis, and you can't do this with cancers and radiation. We have no idea really how much, what kind of exposure. We can't correlate any cancer to an exposure yet, especially at low doses. I mean, you can at higher doses, obviously, but we're not concerned with that. And I think that is the real problem, that we make risk decisions and even risk comparisons when there is no real confidence in the numbers. And you've got to get away from considering those numbers emotionally.
Thank you.
Can I make a comment?
Oh,
On air
just-
pollution studies, nobody that does those studies is able to tell you what the exposure is to the population that they're looking at.
Exactly.
And the point is, it's crazy to say, oh, outside monitors are going to be a good way to measure the exposure problem when people spend 90% of their time inside. Think about that.
Any other panelists want to make a comment? Okay. Thank you.
My name is Brett Rosenberg. I'm the Dosimetry Technical Authority for one of the prime contractors here at Hanford. I regularly interact with the employees, and just this morning I saw an email saying someone's concerned about a shallow dose of tens of millirem. And I would like to solicit your feedback, since I cannot in good conscience speak with confidence with error bars as big as they were in the low dose region. I can't say yay or nay the risk. How would you all respond to an employee who's concerned?
So you asked a hard question, and no one on the panel seems to respond. So I'm going to take a stab at that, and I'm going to do that by not fully answering your question, but referring back to the last panel. So from the last panel, and actually from this panel, I came away with 5 important things to think about whenever you're doing a risk communication, and maybe these can help frame your answer. The first one is trust. What kind of trust relationship do you have with that employee, and how can it be better? The second one is transparency. Are you able to give information to that employee that is transparent, that is usable? The third is time. Can you spend the time with that employee so that they can get all their questions asked and answered? Because as we heard, this is an individualized thing. We need to really go to the next T, which is tailoring. You do need to tailor the answers specifically to them. We also talked about trade-offs, which I don't think are particularly relevant in this situation, but maybe they are. Maybe I just haven't thought that through yet. So I just will give you that approach, and maybe I've delayed enough time so the panelists have some even better ideas.
So I've been asked this before, right? And I have a 10-year-old daughter. And I put myself on the same level as this person. And, I say, I have a 10-year-old daughter. I wouldn't be concerned if she was exposed at that level. And when they can see that I am sincere in my response, and I'm not just lecturing them on a curve in showing dose responses, it seems to get accepted in that kind of manner. So, but how safe is safe, right? I mean, so if you're not comfortable telling that person that you feel that's a safe dose, you shouldn't. Right? But in your situation, what you described, that's what I would do. I'd be okay with my daughter getting that dose.
Thanks.
I spent 46 years talking to people who were worried about what they had. And all of these things that Dr. Locke said are the way to do it. If you want to be a good therapist, a good doctor, a good parent, you need to use those tools that you've got. Tell the truth, be honest, be empathetic, but don't generate anxieties when you're dealing with somebody that's got an anxiety that are unjustified. And I think all of those rules that Dr. Locke said would be good rules to follow, have to be the way that you approach it, so that people will say, hey, that's a good guy. He really knows what he's talking about, and he cared about what I was concerned about.
Thanks. Let's move on if we can. I hope that was helpful.
Hi, Bill Beal. I do emergency response. I'm a scientist on Department of Energy response teams for radiological incidents. So the fact that I work in emergency response kind of makes me a little bit out of place here, especially when we're talking about policy, because, like our IAEA colleague here referred to earlier, I don't deal in policy, I deal in guidance, right? And there's flexibility in the rules, the quote rules. So I really, really enjoyed the earlier discussions, the earlier speakers talking about risk communication, especially engaging the public. And I happened to notice that, I mean, it was focused heavily on Fukushima. So my question is, with an actual question mark, do we have the speakers from earlier, whether it's the two panelists that are currently up there or anyone else who has some input on this, or possibly the two speakers that aren't currently on the panel, if you'll acknowledge that. Is there any difference in the approach to take and the kind of messages or the strategy for communicating with the public when there isn't a disaster or something catastrophic to hang that empathy on, when it's a long-term cleanup site or something like that? Is there a difference in the way you should approach the communication when it's policy and not guidance, and when it's the regulators that get to set the standards and not the local populace?
Thank you. It's a good question. Did you want to address that?
Okay, maybe I might start.
Please.
What you have said, you have asked, one thing I can say is that in the case of emergency, at the early time, probably you don't have to worry too much about the people's response, in a sense that they are feared, really trapped in a fear. They obey or they just behave whatever you want them to behave. But when things start to settle down, then there's a discrepancy showing up. That is individual decisions and individual desire, individual things, all of these personal things start to just coming out, while policymakers are always going with generic rule. And you cannot make the rule to be individualized. So this is a time when these two things to become separated. And my experience is very small. And but one thing I can say is I can rely on face-to-face communication rather than public communication. And only by doing face-to-face, you can gain trust. And also for this face-to-face communication, on our side, researcher side, we really have to approach with empathy. So both sides, we feed empathy, we work with empathy, and then they start to just trusting us. And I really don't know. So government and policymakers, they have very big problem that, individualized one, they are not caring about because they are always dealing with society. So this is a kind of very difficult point. Nobody ever solved this problem, I'm sure. It's a kind of society itself and individual, this confrontation kind. So that's all I can say. で、何か言うことある？例えば。
緊急時のことは事前に用意しておかないとどうしようもないので、事前に用意しておくことというのと透明性をその時に確保しておく。
So what she says is transparency, and also especially at the time for the emergency, she only says that this, some tool to be used as the emergency have to be prepared well enough beforehand with good transparency to the public.
Okay, thank you. That was a great question and a great response. But I know looks like we have about 18 minutes left, so I do want to move on.
Hi, my name is Yasuhiro Muranaka. I happen to be a Japanese American and used to work at the fuel fabrication plant for FFTF. Regarding the issues that were addressed earlier, I wanted to publicly state that I'm one of the few who can actually shed light on the difference in the perceived high-risk facility siting process in the United States and in Japan. Now, United States, we go through individual states have their own public siting council, what have you. There are plenty of intervention by the public and villagers, what have you. Now, over in Japan, that is handled very differently. Villagers, well, in the form of village government, county government, state government, which is called prefecture over there, given money ahead of time for compensation. Now, they don't call it compensation for probable accident and its consequences, but they are given money, and at those opportunities, there are plenty of people who are able to affect their opinion and oppositions. And there are huge number of towns and counties in Japan who had rejected siting those type of facilities, such as chemical plants, nuclear plants, on and on. Now, I don't mean to belittle the plight of those people, but people who were living there did have hand in having to live next to the plant. So the victim narrative often feeds the fear response and stress, which results individually as well as government action, which was evacuation that killed 1,600 people. Now, if we can mitigate the fear itself from those people, as an example, those of us who are in American Nuclear Society or Health Physics Society, we may actually demonstrate our belief by action. That is to say, those of us who are retired, may be a good idea for us to make a colony and live right in there to demonstrate our belief. And these kind of things are almost societal responsibility for us individuals. And that's all I want to say.
Thank you. I think I'm going to just coin the term nuclear homesteading and put your name on it.
Okay, I'm Philip Thomas, and I notice that an awful lot of people in the room are industrialists. So I will say that I used to be in industry. I used to be in charge of decommissioning the Windscale advanced gas reactor, and then through no fault of my own, I find myself in academia, where I hold the chair of risk management at the University of Bristol. And I have a question concerning, which I think I'm looking for responses possibly from John Dunn, from Ryoko, and from Thomas Hansen. And I'm reflecting on remarks that were made last night in his speech by Bill Magwood, which freely translated suggested that it's going to take a long time to sort out what's going on in the low-dose region. And it's going to take the regulators even longer before they make any changes. But one of the things that I would note is that it is possible already to use the existing theory and paradigms, perhaps to far better effect. And when I say that, we were actually the audience, the conference was challenged yesterday to say what its dose rate over a year they would be prepared to accept and still live in their own homes. And it was suggested, was it 50 millisieverts or 100 millisieverts, which I think translates from my recollection into 5 rem or 10 rem in the first year. I can actually provide a complete answer to that based on our J-value calculations for what happened at Fukushima. At Fukushima, the people in Tomioka town and all the rest were evacuated. In Tomioka town, they were facing a dose of 51 millisieverts over the first year. That meant they had a loss of life expectancy of 3 months. 3 months was not enough to trigger the J values saying that they should be evacuated. It would have needed to have been 4.5 months. So 4.5 months, so if we take our 50 millisieverts, multiply it by 1.5, then we're up to 75 millisieverts in the first year. A dose continuing for the next 60 years, or 70 years, but falling continuously over that time. So that there, I actually have an answer, and it's an answer which actually can be justified totally and totally objectively. So my question to the panelists is, if they agree that realistically it's going to take a long time to move to anything other than a linear no dose, no threshold dose model, is it not a good idea to start working in terms of calculating loss of life expectancy and then taking the entirely objectively validated J value to determine these cost-benefit analyses?
Thank you. I'm going to just exercise chair's prerogative here. Since there are many people lined up, I'm going to ask the panelists to perhaps caucus with you later to try to answer that question, which, by the way, I would say you pose like an academic, which I also mean as a compliment. We'll open it up to the entire panel.
Okay, so a thing that's been missed out on this conference, I think, is when we talked about the epidemiology, we didn't talk about the limitations of many of these epidemiological studies, right? There's a good reason why the LSS study is the best. And no offense to people studying Russians, but it's not the same thing. It's not the same type of study, right? There's some really fantastic advantages of the LSS study. That cohort is great, and that's why we use that cohort. Unfortunately, they're all almost dead. So we've learned what we're going to learn from that cohort, right? Maybe we'll get one more chance to study the last few people before they die, but then that's it. So to the point, are we ever going to resolve this with science? I'm not so sure.
Thanks. Let's take maybe one more comment, maybe a minute. Did you want to say something,
The
Jim?
tools are available to apply any good scientific method to any risk assessment project. They're available. The agencies are required to look at new ways to do things. I don't think it's a problem at all. I think it could be easily done if you could convince the agencies to consider a new method, then they can use it. And they can use it for what we call risk assessment and risk trade-offs.
Okay, thank you, John.
So the title of this panel was Okay, well, the title of the panel was Communication and Policy. And I would so one of the topics that was discussed this morning was communication of risk, communication with each other, communication with the public, and it's all framed in a very agonistic way, like us versus them. We are not the public, we are academics, but we are not a correct cross-section of the public. My observation would be that, in standing at the back of this line, we're not engaging with each other. If it's not in your camp or something that you are actively coining a response to because it is not in your camp, like I'm watching people tune out. People are very much in their tablets and in their laptops and their phones. So my question to the panel is this. We've talked about how to communicate outside of the house of this group of people. How do we communicate with each other? Because I feel like a policy decision couldn't be reached unless we can actively engage as a group and hear each other and address those kinds of concerns. So could the panel speak to that?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question.
I was so impressed with this crowd that I would be willing to talk to any of you about any of these things, because I think that's what makes sense. We need to have a level of communication among professionals that are interested in the issue. You just can't go out in the street and say, "Hey, would you like to talk about LNT?" Right? So I would hope that the Nuclear Society would start up something so that things could be achieved in those directions.
Let me maybe offer a couple of thoughts. First, I want to acknowledge the ANS and HPS for bringing us together. That's a first step. Beyond that, I think some important things, from my perspective solely, are developing a more common language and a more common respect for the underlying sciences. This is one thing I've learned being in the ionizing radiation world, that there are perspectives, and to some extent, if you're an excellent scientist, you have to have a perspective in your field. But what we're asking people to do here is kind of look beyond that, and that's not easy. So I would think that that would be a first step, and I really appreciate the question, because I think you are right. Communication among this group is key for moving forward. I don't know if other panelists want to.
I didn't mean to insult the HPS or the health physics people by not mentioning them. They are obviously a valuable part of this discussion.
I was covering for you, John.
Thank you.
I just have one thing. On behalf of ICRP, I was past member of ICRP. At least LNT-based radiation protection system this has long history, and this is the kind of consensus already built to make this radiation protection system. So it's very nice to have this kind of opportunity to have quite a variety of people's opinion, but we probably ICRP might be probably happy to just show what the process of this LNT thing came up currently. And it's a long, long, long history of struggle of human, maybe people with wisdom. So we have a lot to discuss, even after this meeting, probably. And it's very nice that you brought up that point.
Thank you.
So my question, I'm Jennifer Bean. I work here with the WTP on the vitrification plant. And my question was for people outside of the affected group, in your case of Fukushima and Suigetsu, or in South Africa where there's outside potentially the siting plans. Do you know of either involvement or just know of other groups that are involved with trying to discuss the radiation risks and help communicate the concerns and alleviate them? Or how has that been going, since you mentioned where when people had moved out of the area, there was a increased risks of suicide among them because of stigma for them being from locations where radiation contamination had been?
Did you want to?
One of the problems that we have in South Africa, as all over here, is the public. The public in South Africa does not trust nuclear science. For example, most of Cape Town is supplied by the Koeberg reactors, 1.8 gigawatt output reactors. A lot of people in Cape Town are afraid to turn on the lights because they feel that the radiation Koeberg gets transmitted through the wires, and they're subjected to radiation when they turn on the lights. That is a tremendous challenge, and it's something that I've heard people talk about communicating to each other, but the big challenge is to communicate to the public, to be able to convince the public that nuclear energy is safe. And this is, if you look at the ingrained fear of nuclear energy, this will be such a huge task. And I think that's one of the things that I think very little attention has been paid to that. And the people in the other fields of energy, like wind and solar, have done a much better job in communicating the advantages of their type of energy compared to what we have done in nuclear energy. And we have to be a lot more active in promoting our technology to the public. So I hope that partially answers your concern.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Ando-san tells me that those who evacuated from Fukushima, they are having very difficult time, definitely. And at the same time, Hiroshima people suffered from this stigma. And after 70 years, Hiroshima is really booming up, economically very strong. Stigma is gone. So it takes time. But one other thing that my input to this problem is Homo sapiens evolved as a societal animal. We form society, small band, try to cope or try to just shut off other tribes or community is a way we just handled. And stigma is a very efficient way to cut people out, certain section of the people out. So once you have this stigma wall, you are very happy and cozy sometimes. And but this is happening all over the world, from schoolyard, bullying things, and many aspects of our life being somehow tinted by our own egos, which been serving Homo sapiens to evolve to the current status. So it's a very intrinsic problem, one more time, but it's very important how to cope with our own self.
Okay, thank you. I think we have, where's my timekeeper back there? We have probably time for maybe one or two more questions.
Okay, Grant Tao. I am occupational and environmental epidemiologist. I happen to know John Samet, and I also do some study in air pollution. So I have a comment on John's comment on other John Samet's statement. When he say there's no safe level for particle, means two things. One, the safe, this term is very relative. There's no absolute safe level for anything. Yeah, radiation, everything. When he said that, it means this. So as an epidemiologist, we never say this is a safe. So I learned a term in my response yesterday. We can say it's not dangerous, but we never say it's safe. What is the safe level? If I ask you, probably you have a problem to say that too. The second meaning is when they say there's no safe level, is I learned today from Dr. Hansen, it's a trade-off. It's the cost benefit. So in order to manage this risk, it's worthwhile to take a lot of money to do that, to manage that risk. So it's a trade-off issue. So when he say it's no absolute safe level, it doesn't mean that everything's we need to reduce the risk to the zero, like radiation. We need to do something, like a trade-off. That's what I want to comment on.
John Salmon is a smart guy. When he uses the word safe, he knows what people are going to interpret it as. He knows what the politicians will say. Okay, Dr. Samet says there's no safe level of small particles. The language is clear. What he's saying is there is no threshold for harm. And that's the key that I was trying to emphasize. He essentially created another no threshold situation with regards to air pollution because he said there is no safe level of air pollution. And I'm saying there's plenty of safe levels of a lot of things. There are lots of thresholds out there. We just have to look for them and do the research that will show the evidence of where it is that you will not see an observable effect.
Yeah, to be quick, threshold is also a relative level. That's depending on the trade-off too, right? So what do you define the risk is something we need to talk about. Okay, thank you.
So on this vigorous note, and as a former student of John Salmon, who was on my dissertation committee, I have to now report back to him that he was being discussed. I guess we might have time for maybe one more comment, maybe two more comments, I see, maybe three more comments. Okay, I'm going to say we're going to have time for three more comments if people are willing to stay, but we do have a noontime speaker. I don't want to break into that. So let's see if we can move this along as fast as possible.
I'll be very quick because I wanted to say exactly what was just said. I think we try not to use the word safe because it's relative. And just because there's a threshold that goes to 0 doesn't mean that 0 is safe and that's the only safe. Speed limits are linear in a sense that if your speed limit is 2 miles per hour on the highway, you're going to get hit from behind and get killed. I mean, there's risk of everything. But what is appropriate and what is well done is can be anything. So my question to the panel is, what do you think about that? Is safe a word to use or not?
I try not to use that word personally in my communication, risk communication. I don't know how other panelists feel about it.
We're going to have to figure this out, right? Because unless we tell the public it's safe, it's never going to be accepted, right? I mean, we're dealing with the public, right? So it's tough, right? There's no safe limit, but what's safe, right? What are we going to tolerate? We're going to have to call it something. We're going to have to call it, like this gentleman here, he does a good job of coming up with terminology to make things like spent fuel acceptable. We need to come up with a terminology that reflects the level that is safe.
The problem I have with the word safe is it assumes that I am making a judgment for you. And my goal as a risk communicator is to empower you to make that judgment for yourself. That's why I don't use the term.
Mine's fairly quick as well. I haven't heard anyone talk about citizen science. And one of the strategies that we're discussing in Australia is to actually have citizen science programs where the citizens actually collect and analyse their own data. And I was just wondering whether anyone on the panel has had a good experience with that, and because surely that would help influence policy.
I ask people all the time who come to see me who are sick, their problem, but they also tell me what they know about it because most people will do that. So I think that these things, that's an excellent example of the kind of communications things we want to emphasize as being the way to get public policy in accord with what the public can understand to be good policy. And we have to make our case for how good policy can be developed. I think you're right.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much for everybody else for actually staying. I'm from IAEA. I want to follow up on the comment I made earlier with a question. And the question is this: do you believe that the approach of driving down radiation doses, perhaps way beyond what's justified or optimized, engenders confidence, which is what it's meant to do, or has it got the opposite effect? Thank you.
Wow, that's a loaded question, if ever. I just want to point out, while the panelists are thinking about that, one of the things we really haven't had a chance to address much here, although it was mentioned once, is the idea of social license. So with radiation, radiation for benefit, there's a social license to operate, and that may be, if you will, the other side of the equation we need to think about. I'm not an expert in that, but it's always something that I think about. How do we give the public the confidence so that they feel we have that social license to operate?
Confidence, fear, and confidence. And we are in a position to provide people with information that will make them confident that things are being handled in a way that's proper so they won't be so anxious. A number of doctors at this conference have talked about the problem of what amounts to fear that prevents good medical care. And that's just an excellent example of the thing that I saw all the time. People came back from the radiology department and they decided they didn't want to have the procedure because a radiology technician scared the devil out of them. And I'm ordering a CT to decide whether I can save their life. And so I think it's important for us to promote this kind of thing. People need to get engaged in these things so that they won't be so scared.
So John, I think you get the last word because I've been told they are not going to let us eat if we don't move into the other room. So thank you, panelists. Really appreciate it. And also for everyone who commented.